An idyllic Pacific island that claimed thousands of lives.
They were angry, and they were fighting harder than they'd ever fought before.
A Russian bastion that turned into a vital center of healing.
This place was armed for war against enemy ships, but it's gone down in history for a battle against a very different kind of enemy.
An imperialist prison in Romania, which became a hotbed of revolution.
Getting sent here was a perfect opportunity for a young communist activist.
And a remote complex in Chile built on treachery.
They were minding their own business, and they trusted this person. And in the end, he betrayed them.
Decaying relics. Ruins of lost worlds. Sites haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. Peleliu, a tiny island in the Western Pacific, its tranquility at odds with a hostile history.
It's this beautiful coral island covered in jungle palms.
But the creeping vegetation conceals remains of an ominous infrastructure.
There's even now the debris of warfare. Tanks, amphibious tractors, guns and gun emplacements.
Do you notice that what looks to be an airstrip has been carved out of the jungle?
And below ground, there's more.
A closer look reveals quite a lot of ravines and hollows, almost dotted with caves.
And in them, you can see evidence of past occupation, the archaeology of war.
This place was known for a time as hell on earth.
Des Machutaro is a local historian whose ancestors witnessed the destruction unleashed here.
This island was devastated beyond any one of my people's imagination, because we've never seen destruction like this in our lives.
The airstrip cutting through the heart of this island is the first clue to what went on here.
Here we've got an island that's relatively low in form, and it has some areas which are flat enough to construct an airfield, and so it became a very strategic point in this part of the Pacific.
Next to the airfield stands a distinctive ruin, which looks like some kind of control center. But it wasn't the local people running the operation.
There's a headquarters building, very much in the Japanese imperial style, very grand in size. Clearly, this was a place that was going to harbor a lot of Japanese naval and military personnel.
Not only was it a place for them to do their work, there was areas of a living quarters that they had here. This building also has a nerve center where the high-ranking officials had their top secret and sensitive materials inside.
As these scarred remains show, war was coming to Peleliu. By 1944, the US Marines were fighting their way through the Japanese-controlled islands in the Western Pacific.
The whole American strategy was island hopping. So we hop from necessary island to necessary island.
The kind of air support that would be required for the operations to retake the Philippines and to take Japan needed airfields, needed islands. That meant that the Leathernecks, the US Marine Corps, had to retake those islands.
Peleliu was their next target. But there were some who thought that an invasion here was unnecessary.
There was talk and the American command of bypassing it, but the Marines were already on their transports, the Naval Task Force was already setting sail for Peleliu, and it was decided, well, it's probably going to be easy, so let's just do it.
They assumed that the Japanese would do the same thing they always did and try to stop invaders on the beach. The last thing they expected was that the Japanese army would have learned from its mistakes. But they did.
The stage was set for a bloody showdown between two great military powers.
So we've got two American rounds that were lodged into this column here. You can see by the trajectory where it went in, came from my left side, and that's where the landing beaches are at.
8:30 a.m., September the 15th. The Marines began the agonizingly slow journey towards the beaches in amphibious vehicles.
We're at Orange Beach, where the Americans began their invasion onto this island. It was highly defended due to the fact that this beach is actually the shortest distance between the water and the actual runway, which was the main objective.
After a week of fierce fighting and unbearable temperatures, the airfield was secure.
The 1st Marine Division managed to take the airfield on Peleliu Island comparatively quickly.
It appeared that victory was in sight. But aerial intelligence collected before the invasion had failed to spot a key detail. The Marines were walking into a trap.
Part of the problem with identifying a lot of the features of the island from above is when you have thick vegetation, you can hide sheer cliffs, you can hide quite a lot of the topography under a blanket of green.
So it looked like, oh, if I take the island, I've got the whole island.
The Japanese defenders had made the most of Peleliu's hidden geography.
It's made out of predominantly ancient coral reef limestone that dissolves into caves and natural ravines. And actually, it's quite a soft rock. You can actually build your own defenses into the mountain.
It had been impossible for US intelligence to identify the extent of the massive Japanese defense network hidden below ground.
This cave that we have here in Peleliu, there's about 300 to 400 of them. It took about 10 months to develop and construct these caves. Many of the caves were also dug out by local labor as well. Prior to the invasion, the Japanese had evacuated all the local men off this island due to the fact that they didn't want any of the local men to go over to the US side and reveal the locations of these caves.
The Japanese commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, could control the entire defense from the heart of this cliffside fortress.
The Japanese were hunkered in within this ridge. Many Japanese men had lived and stayed in these caves, very harsh conditions. Some of these caves were small enough for one person, his gear, and some supplies. Many Americans call that a sniper cave or a foxhole. Other caves are actually much bigger, and they would connect with other caves and interlock and form a network of caves up to a dozen or so entrances.
The fight for Peleliu was about to become one of the most brutal of the Pacific campaign.
It's a real departure, Peleliu, from the normal Japanese doctrine, which is to fight at the water's edge, deny the Marines a foothold. The Marines get ashore, take the airstrip, but then they're pounded from this central height, this big massif that overlooks the island.
The Japanese defense was designed to pound fire down into pre-registered positions where they knew the Americans would have to come.
To fully control the island, the Marines needed to take the high ground.
The Americans called that Bloody Nose Ridge, because 1st Marine Division They went up there and they got a bloody nose.
The battle for Bloody Nose Ridge was just absolutely ferocious. For the Marines, it was having to fight this deadly adversary that had essentially entombed himself inside this cliff face. And he had to be dug out, and he was not going to surrender.
What it came down to was grunts with rifles, mortars, and guns.
Peleliu's network of caves and tunnels meant that the Marines could never be sure where their enemy was.
American soldiers would be running up an American flag, and then they would smell Japanese rice cookers underneath them as the Japanese were still installed in these fortified caverns under their feet.
After nearly 2 months of grinding their way up Bloody Nose Ridge, the US forces were finally closing in on victory.
The Japanese commander on the island transmits a last message to Tokyo saying, you know, all is lost, the island has fallen, and then he and his staff commit suicide.
This is where they found the body of Colonel Kunio Nakagawa. When the Americans came to this part of the island and found his body, that's when they declared the Battle of Peleliu over.
But for some, the conflict was not done.
2 years after World War II was over, a Japanese official had to come to Peleliu to prove to the remaining Japanese soldiers that the war was really over, that they could put their guns down and go home.
More than 12,000 US and Japanese soldiers lost their lives in the ferocious battle for Peleliu, and many more were injured.
After the war, the Americans calculated that so good were the Japanese defenses that it took 1,500 rounds of bullets, grenades, or artillery to kill a single Japanese defender.
And when the locals returned to the island, it was unrecognizable.
My people were asked by the Americans to bring in fruits and vegetables to replant here, bring back coconuts, bring back papayas, bring back bananas to replant, because the island was flattened.
In the icy waters that surround St. Petersburg, Russia, is an oddly shaped structure.
It's got 2 long sides that are both rounded off at the end. It looks a bit like a kidney bean in shape.
It's made of solid brick and concrete, and the outside is an ominous black.
A closer look reveals something unexpected.
There's a large courtyard surrounded by rounded architecture, and it almost looks like a Mediterranean plaza.
Inside, it's a work of art.
There's this steel staircase that's rusting away, but exquisitely formed. This place was not built in a hurry, and it wasn't built on a budget either.
But further in, things take a chilling turn.
The inside of this building is empty, almost as if it's been stripped or sterilized.
This imposing fortification was built to intimidate. But what it was designed for and what it became are 2 very different things.
This place was armed and prepared for a sea battle, but it ended up fighting a very different war.
So how did this sterile shell come to save lives instead of taking them? Russian archaeologist Sergei Solovyov has explored this marooned stronghold many times.
Ну вот в начале XIX века возникла необходимость создания новых оборонительных сооружений для защиты Кронштадта и Петербурга.
The deep waters of the Gulf of Finland have long left Russia open to attack.
At one end is Russia's old capital city of St. Petersburg, and at the opposite end are Europe's other great powers: France, Germany, Britain.
And by the 1830s, the Russians needed to build a new fort in the Gulf itself to keep their capital safe.
Для постройки этого оборонительного сооружения необходимо было создание искусственного острова.
Building an island, then the fort on top, took 7 years. The result was the distinctively designed Fort Alexander.
Ну, по тем временам он, по мнению современников, и не только российских, но и западных, то есть здесь было 103 пушки только в казематах на 3 ярусах и 34 на открытом верхнем ярусе. Вот, то есть для кораблей того времени это совершенно было неприступное оборонительное сооружение.
But the guns of the Tsar's imperious fortress would never fire a single shot in battle. Because by 1845, soon after its completion, Fort Alexander had become redundant.
Military weaponry was becoming so powerful that the fort's walls could no longer withstand an enemy's shelling.
But decades later, the fort did see action when Russia was attacked by an enemy more deadly than any navy. In the late 19th century, a pandemic was spreading across the world: the bubonic plague.
The plague had already ravaged parts of the globe twice before, in the 6th century and in the 14th century. This disease spread from country to country through different ports. At every port, rats would escape from the ships, but it was really their fleas that spread the disease.
And with the growth of international trade, by the 1890s, the so-called Third Plague pandemic was reaching its peak.
It had already reached parts of Europe and was now knocking on Russia's door.
Заинтересованы в получении, скорее, какой-то противочумной вакцины. И были организованы 2 лаборатории. Одна в Институте Парижа, в Институте Пастеров.
The Russian government decide they're going to study the disease in a lab. Have lots of scientists working with samples, trying to find a vaccine. And of course, they had the perfect place to do it.
The isolated artificial island of Fort Alexander, with its high-level security, was about to come into its own.
Существовал Императорский институт экспериментальной медицины, но первоначально даже опыты начали ставиться.
The mighty fort had to be repurposed to contain the unseen enemy now inside its walls.
В период существования чумной лаборатории на форте форт был поделен на 2 части. Правая сторона – это была заразная часть, левая сторона – незаразная.
Within the infectious side of the fort, the laboratory setup was scrupulous.
Эта лаборатория была построена по самому последнему слову техники, науки и техники. То есть здесь было и паровое отопление, и газоснабжение, электричество. Было подготовлены помещения под лаборатории, место содержания разного рода животных для проживания и персонала.
The labs in their operation were pretty sophisticated for the time, and they had, vials, test tubes, lab coats.
The first floor of the fort had a series of laboratory facilities, libraries, conference rooms, and something surprising.
Мы находимся в помещении, которое, вероятно, использовалось в качестве конюшни.
Rodents, monkeys, and reindeer were also used for trials here.
They brought in animals to this fort so that they could infect them with the plague.
There are photographs of how they'd perform autopsies on the animals, pinning their legs back with wires. It's gruesome stuff.
The laboratories extended to the fort's second floor.
They experimented with different types of the disease. They even made a dust that could be inhaled. And in other instances, they simply injected the specimen into animals' windpipes.
But it was only a matter of time before something went wrong.
With all the lab's sophistication, they still couldn't completely remove the possibility of the disease escaping.
The scientists used the fort's isolated upper levels to deal with the unthinkable.
Мы находимся на третьем этаже форта, на третьем ярусе, где был устроен лазарет для зараженных в случае заражения чумой.
Despite stringent safety measures, they had to use this isolation unit at the start of 1904, when the laboratory's head doctor contracted the plague and died. 3 years later, the disease escaped again. This time, the esteemed epidemiologist Lev Podlievsky and his friend and colleague Dr. Schreiber were on the front line. When Schreiber developed symptoms of the plague, Dr. Podlievsky rushed him up to the dreaded third floor.
Здесь содержался доктор Шрайбер в течение его болезни.
He died within 3 days, and with the body still contagious, Dr. Podlievsky had to perform the autopsy.
Shortly after the postmortem of his colleague, Dr. Podlievsky started to feel a burning sensation in his fingers.
But the researchers' sacrifices were about to pay off.
Things looked grim for Dr. Podlievsky, but his colleagues started administering some of the antidotes they'd been working on. And in a few days, it looked like they were starting to work.
Podlievsky and the other scientists had developed a cure.
Ему ввели противочумную вакцину, в течение 10-12 дней он пошел на поправку и в итоге выздоровел. Опять-таки, это благоприятный исход, это очень радует, и что ему удалось все-таки полечиться. Которая была уже разработана вот в этой противочумной лаборатории.
As well as finding an antidote to the plague, the fort's scientists also worked successfully on diseases such as tetanus, typhoid, and cholera. But in 1917, the Russian Revolution brought the work of the imperialist plague laboratory to an end. However, with the antidote inaccessible to most, the third plague pandemic lived on for the next 4 decades, claiming 15 million lives, before petering out in 1959. Fort Alexander earned a reputation not through taking lives in battle, but through saving them. And Sergei wants to preserve it, to remember those who gave everything to do so.
Состояние форта нынешнее весьма печальное и, конечно, требует большой работы по реставрации и восстановлению всех его прежнего облика.
In the remote Telega region of Romania lies an imposing set of ruins.
You come across the big steel gate leading to a building that looks like something out of a Dickens novel.
There are also outside spaces around the outer parts, which are almost like courtyards or gardens.
The structure of this place is distinctive.
It's a strange sort of horseshoe shape. It has rings radiating out, and this is clearly the most important and key part of the building.
It looks like a mansion or a wealthy home, but once you get inside, the story is completely different.
There are gaping holes in the roofs, whole walls turned to rubble.
It looks like it's been ravaged by more than just time.
A bizarre, broken replica of the building itself hints at its greater significance.
This ruined building set in motion a chain of events that would change this country forever.
This is Doftana Prison. Scott Alsop studies this tattered site, which once filled Romanians with dread.
Doftana, I've been surprised to find, is not really remembered that much by many Romanians, and yet the prison guards regarded this as like the Bastille of Romania.
The complex dates back to 1895, but it wasn't until 2 decades later that it came into its own.
What was happening in the early years of the Soviet Union turned a lot of heads in Romania, where a battle was brewing between the monarchy and the communists.
In 1924, under King Ferdinand, the government outlawed communism in Romania.
That anti-monarchism, so characteristic of communism, was one of the main reasons why the Romanian royal family wanted to imprison communists.
King Ferdinand was very worried about threats to his rule. So he designated this location to become a prison for political prisoners.
By the mid-1920s, around 300 political prisoners were locked up in Doftana.
The fact that there is a single place where the burgeoning Romanian Communist Party was all placed together is absolutely fascinating.
If you lock up together a group of active, passionate political ideologues, you're asking for trouble.
This was more like a university of communism than it was a punishment for being a communist.
They can develop their ideology. They can indoctrinate other prisoners into their ideology, so that by the time they get out, they are a much more disciplined force.
The prisoners were even compiling a communist newspaper from within Doftana's walls.
The fact that they were able to do this all under the noses of the guards was amazing.
But separated by the prison cells, the inmates had to find inventive ways to talk to each other.
So in some of the cells in Doftana, there were heating pipes, similar to this one back here. And as a way to communicate, many of the communists developed a tapping system in order to send messages between cells by using the heating system.
They used wooden bed slats to pass pencils and documents through cell bars. They even stitched makeshift bags from bedding materials to help pass around their clandestine materials.
But they still faced the problem of how to get the newspaper out of the prison. A nearby river provided them with everything they needed.
Doftana is positioned on the hills just behind me, and the storm drains that were within the prison grounds ran down to this river. And so the newspaper was sent down the storm drains and ended up in this river where they were collected by local party members. The communists inside the walls were absolutely determined to get their story out.
These were men who believed in a political cause, and they were willing to go to great risks to try to bring that cause into reality.
The wide-reaching influence of Doftana prison didn't end there.
An extremely famous leader who changed the course of modern Romanian history forever was once held right here in Doftana.
In 1936, a new inmate was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment for communist activities.
The name of this new arrival was Nikolai Chaushesku.
By the time Chaushesku was sent here to Doftana at 18 years old, he was already described as a dangerous communist agitator.
Chaushesku was young, headstrong, and utterly captivated by communist ideology.
On his arrival there, he would have been surrounded by like-minded communist activists.
The monarchy was still in control, but that would soon end.
World War II completely changed the landscape of Romania. They were one of the most active allies of Nazi Germany.
The Germans were finally pushed out by Soviet troops. In the aftermath of the war, the Soviets installed a communist government in Romania.
The man at the helm was Gheorghe Gheorghiu Dej, a former Doftana inmate imprisoned with Chaushesku. Following a series of earthquakes, the newly installed communist government closed the prison down and repurposed it for its own glorification.
It was opened as a museum to effectively honor all of those founders of Romanian communism who had been held here.
The propaganda museum even featured a scale model of the place itself.
Doftana was absolutely vital to the communist leadership. It was important that they were able to show how communism was effectively able to conquer the bourgeois elements of society that had preceded it. We have evidence of leading communists from China being brought on tours to Doftana to prove how communism was able to overcome those obstacles.
When Gheorghiu Dej died in 1965, Chaushesku came to power.
Chaushesku went from being a revered leader to an incredibly feared dictator.
As his time in office went on, he became increasingly totalitarian and violent against his own people. Ceausescu's control was really summarized by the secret police that he introduced into the country.
Ceausescu's Romania is one of the worst examples in existence of a truly totalitarian, repressive communist dictatorship.
Eventually, the collapse of communism triggered violent uprisings in Romania.
In 1989, Ceausescu ordered his forces to open fire on anti-government demonstrators, and this was just a step too far for the Romanian people.
The armed forces revolted and captured Ceausescu before putting him on trial and convicting him of mass murder. Ceausescu's end came when he was shot by a firing squad on Christmas Day.
Doftana prison also fell from grace.
No one was really interested in going back to the prison as a kind of monument, and it continued to decay and fall into disrepair.
Today, the authorities continue to leave the prison to rot.
The terrifying leaders that emerged from it will long remain a part of the Romanian consciousness.
In the deep south of Chile, at the edge of a crystal blue lake, sits a town frozen in time.
It doesn't really look like your average lakeside resort.
In one of the most sparsely populated places on Earth are the remains of a once prosperous settlement.
There are shops and a school and a football field, and there is everything you'd want in a nice town. It's just empty.
There's lots of abandoned, kind of rusting machinery. There's clearly something that would have been being processed.
A curious structure built into a mountain could offer up some clues.
It's almost as if the building has been draped into the hillside.
I guess it's trying to use in some way the geography that's already there, but why?
At its height, This was one of the most important buildings to the Chilean economy.
Luis Casanova's father bought this now deserted site back in 1995.
The first time that I came here, I was about 10 years old. The feeling was like this place was alive.
This is Puerto Cristal. In Patagonia, in the Aysén region, this deserted town seems to sit at the end of the world.
90 years ago, there was almost nothing here until the first family moved in.
Luis has studied the story of Puerto Cristal and knows of the tragedy that befell its first settlers.
The first family that lived here was called the Inayao family. They settled here because they wanted to have a life farming.
Saturnino Inayao arrived with his family in the 1930s.
They were homesteaders. They wanted to farm this countryside. They wanted to break this ground. They came to stake a claim and make a life for themselves in what they must have thought was the wildest spot on earth.
The Inayao family built a house and started farming, unaware of the vast riches below their feet.
One day, one of the children in the Inayao family discovered this odd-looking rock. And the father recognized there was something unique about it.
It was gray, it was shiny, it was heavy. And Saturnino took the rock to his neighbor and asked him if he knew what it was.
The farmer then gave it to a supposed friend. They went off and actually found out that potentially there could have been fortune to be made.
They discovered that this particular rock had over 60% of lead.
The mountainous terrain was rich in zinc as well as lead.
Although you're not finding gold, if you find lead and zinc in such amounts that it becomes commercially viable to distribute it around the world, you can make a lot of money.
The Inayao family now had the potential to become millionaires because of what they found on their property. However, the Inayao family would never see a cent of that.
Saturnino Inayao had made the mistake of asking the businessman Silva Ormeño for help.
As soon as Ormeño realized that this was lead, he went and registered the land under his own name, and he promptly evicted the Inayao family.
With Inayao gone and the land rights eventually ending up with the Aysén Mining Company, in 1945, construction began. And within 3 years, an efficient lead and zinc processing operation was in place.
At its height, this was a modern, effective, productive industrial installation.
We are inside of the processing plant for the ore. The first time I came here, it was still working, so you could hear the machines. It was really loud, and you could see a lot of dust.
The metallic ores were easy to mine, but hard to process. These rusting relics show how it was done.
The first step is this, where you have a primary crusher. Then, on the bottom of this machine, you have a conveyor belt that moves all the material to the next step.
Next came the grinder.
Here, everything that was heavy moved up, and the rest that was lighter stayed here.
The operation was crammed inside the hill-hugging building.
The strange shape of this building, it's because they wanted to make the process more efficient. So if you follow the slope of the hill, it's easier to move it. The last part of the process is to allow the material to settle down because of the gravity, and then you can pack it and export it.
By the 1950s, Puerto Cristal's lead and zinc was being exported all over the world. The population had risen to 850, and the mining company did all it could to keep them here.
They give them everything they needed. They didn't have to pay for their house or the tap water, electricity, anything of that. And they had access to all the basic services like health, education.
This is a place where Chileans could come, could put their roots down, and could really feel they were part of a place.
In the 60s, you had this sense of community with a lot of people playing around in the soccer field, the children in the school. So it was a close community. It was hard work and a hard labor, but they had things and a quality life that you couldn't get back then.
The industry at Puerto Cristal was still going strong in the 1990s, when Luis's father bought into the processing plant.
He was really surprised when he arrived because he didn't expect to see all the buildings and all the infrastructure that you had here.
But the thriving plant soon fell on hard times.
The price of zinc on Asian markets dropped, and the price of lead on Asian markets dropped, and that meant that this facility was no longer viable.
In the late 90s, it was so expensive to be here extracting the ore, so that's the reason why he decided to close the mine.
With no work to keep them there, the population left. Now, Luis wants to preserve this place for the sake of his father.
After my dad closed the mine, he remained here until maybe 2010, when he got sick and had to leave the place. And he was the last habitant of Puerto Cristal.